Thank you all for attending our event today on the ongoing crisis in Syria and the region and beyond, even, as Peter will discuss a little bit. This event has been sponsored by the Honda Center for Human Rights and International Justice and the Center for CDDRL here in FSI, the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, not for, on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. So thanks very much for our sponsors and for the lunch. So as the conflict in Syria is now in its 5th year, we know that at least half of the population and maybe more is on the move, internal to Syria and then crossing international borders. About maybe 5 to 6, maybe you can update us on numbers, million people are internationally displaced and now qualify as refugees. Not all of them have been registered with the UNHCR, with the United Nations. Probably at least 1 million have been unregistered. War crimes continue unabated. These crimes are being documented very carefully by the UN Commission of Inquiry, which we'll hear more about, and other human rights organizations. So there's no end of information about what's happening. The conflict, however, has reached a stalemate. We have now 3 parties with also other international parties involved. The Syrian government, which still controls large swaths of territory, no signs of it stepping down or folding. We have a fractured opposition that, you know, separates and comes together and separates and comes together with some support from the United States and a coalition of state. We have Russia now coming in on the side of the government. And of course we have ISIL and other affiliated groups who are embattled with both of the two other parties. And so we're now in a tripartite situation with outside proxies also contributing. No sign of an end game. Maybe we could talk about what some possible end games are. So we've brought together today 2 individuals who are really on the front line of these events, both of whom can talk about their work documenting crimes and abuses within Syria, and also the refugee situation that's happening now that has landed on the shores of Europe. So first we're going to hear from Peter Bouckaert, who's a Stanford Law graduate, but a Belgian native. He is the Emergencies Director at Human Rights Watch, and many of you may be following him on social media platforms, but has had some really compelling and poignant posts from some of the refugee camps around the region. And I recommend his Facebook site if you haven't already signed up for it. And then we have Sharita Ashraf, who since 2012 has been a senior advisor to the UN Commission of Inquiry, formed by the Human Rights Council in Geneva very early on in the conflict. Its mandate has been continually renewed since then. They've had very minimal access to the country, but they've been able to document the crimes quite carefully through working with diaspora communities in refugee camps, Skype interviews, etc. I think she'll talk a little bit about the methodology that they employ and some of the conclusions that they're reaching. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who will get us started. We're going to have each panelist speak for maybe 15 minutes or so. I may throw out a few questions, and then we'll open the discussion to members of the audience. So, thank you, Peter.
Thank you. It's nice to be back at the farm. I even bought a pair of maroon pants. I've been with Human Rights Watch almost 20 years. So many of these conflicts that we're talking about, including the Syria conflict, I was in Iraq in 2003 and have been following that conflict since then. So I'm going to try to bring a little bit of a reflective perspective on what is happening in Syria today, which is a real tragedy. I actually entered Syria right at the beginning of the revolution. When the protests were still going on, I hiked across the mountains of the Turkey-Syrian border to meet with some of the protest leaders before they had resorted to violence. And at that time, it was June 2011, they were being shot down in the streets by the Assad government in peaceful protest, and their rallying cry was Salmiya, Salmiya, peaceful, peaceful. So I had just come from Libya, and I asked them, why is the concept of nonviolent protest so important to you? And there was a big silence in the room, and then one of the protest leaders said, because we know the moment we pick up the gun, Syria will be no more. And obviously that prophetic warning very much came true. I think it's important to remember that this did start as a peaceful protest movement, wanting change, involving many young people who wanted to live with the kind of freedoms that we all take for granted every day. And obviously that dream has gone very bad, not only in Syria, but also in places like Libya, which is in chaos at the moment, and Egypt, which is under a military dictatorship. But I think it's the wrong conclusion to draw that we should have just left the dictators in power. This was not a Western-sponsored protest movement. It was a generational shift of people just not wanting to live under dictatorship anymore, and to not live with fear in their lives anymore. And the real tragedy is that that dream has been brutally crushed in many places. Syria has continued to descend into ever graver violence, ever more severe violence. And the opposition in Syria, the civilian opposition, also has failed to coalesce around a vision of a new future, which has been a real problem from the beginning. I think one of the problems with the Western strategy in Syria is that they have focused almost exclusively on a military solution to this conflict. They have tried to train an opposition movement, an armed opposition movement, and have spectacularly failed in that task. But they have invested very little in trying to foster the kind of dialogue that is needed to get Syria out of this horrific mess. Actually, 2 years ago, myself and women's rights activist Madeleine Rees approached the French ambassador, Ambassador Chevalier, with the idea to actually have a conference of women, Syrian women, to discuss their role in the peace process. And I think it's a pretty extraordinary example of just how the international community has failed Syria, that we had to propose the idea to one of the lead diplomats to put together such a conference. So basically, they had excluded 50% of the population from even the discussion about the future of Syria. And then when we held the conference, after giving the opening remarks, the then UN Special Representative for Syria, Brahimi, walked out of the room for another meeting just as the first woman was about to speak. Anyway, in terms of the rise of the Islamic State, it obviously has complicated the situation even further. But I do think it's very important to understand that the Islamic State and its genesis is very much related to the conflict in Iraq. We can no longer talk just about the conflict in Syria without also talking about the situation in Iraq. And the majority of the leadership of the Islamic State are actually former Ba'athist military intelligence officers who are using the same terror tactics that Saddam Hussein used against the Shia and against the Kurds during the 1980s and the 1990s. They were disposed from power by the American intervention. The army was dissolved, and they ultimately ended up creating this terror organization. But they're not the only bad people on the block. A lot of the work of Human Rights Watch has actually been about documenting the abuses of the Iraqi state and the Shia militias, which have committed such horrific abuses in Iraq and have driven a lot of the Sunni population actually into the hands of ISIS to seek a relative sense of safety from these death squads. It's very important that we don't oversimplify the situation. In terms of what happened now with the Russian intervention, it has obviously made the situation on the ground much worse because the static front lines which existed in many parts of the country, where there was a relative stalemate, which gave some sense, if it's perhaps the wrong word to use, of predictability for the people who remained. That predictability is now gone. I mean, it was a horrible predictability, but now people are living with the fear of changing front lines and are fleeing in very significant numbers because of that. The situation in the neighboring countries also has become unsustainable for many. You know, if you look at the kind of graduation rates from schools in places like Jordan, we just published a report yesterday showing that 400,000 children, Syrian children, are out of school in Turkey. You know, the Syrian people want a better future for their children, and it's very important that we don't have a lost generation Because if an entire generation goes without schooling, it means that they will not be able to rebuild their country. I'm just going to show a quick video and talk for 2 minutes about the refugee situation. This is something I filmed last month of a boat doing the crossing, and then I'll talk about what's happening. There's a father with some young children right at the front of the boat. Afghani? Afghani? Only about a third of the people on the boat actually have life jackets. They're just packed in. So they just set off from the coast in Turkey, and you'll see now they're turning towards the island of Lesbos. It's Lesbos in the background. You can see the people sitting in the middle, on the ground, including a lot of children. We are in an unprecedented refugee crisis now in Europe. Just to give you an idea of how the numbers are increasing, I was on Lesbos recently. In July, 24,000 people arrived on Lesbos. In August, 50,000. And in September, 111,000. The number is now up to 150,000. That means that on some days, 100 of these boats arrive on Lesbos. And 93% of the people arriving are from just 3 conflict areas, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And again, these conflicts are interlinked. Many of the men fleeing from Afghanistan are fleeing because the Iranian government is forcibly recruiting Afghan refugees to go fight in Syria. Many people have lost their lives. Just in the month of October, probably over 100 people drowned off this coast. And the real scandal is not just that children are washing up dead, drowned on the beaches of Europe, but that there's almost no coherent response from the European Union and the international community to the plight of these people who deserve asylum. They are fleeing war and repression, and under international law, they deserve to be treated as refugees. We were working on the beach with only volunteers, giving birth, women giving birth on the beach, treating people with very severe injuries. And as the weather gets colder, we will see a lot of cases of hypothermia. And that's the situation all through the Balkans. People are sleeping out in the open for days, sometimes weeks, trying to reach Western Europe under very, very difficult conditions. So what Human Rights Watch has been advocating is a more coherent response from the European Union, and especially the creation of safe and legal paths to asylum for these people fleeing war. I do think it's a misinterpretation to say that Europe is being flooded by refugees. Even the most pessimistic forecasts of the European Union predict that the refugees in 2015, 2016, and 2017 will add 0.4% to the population of Europe. So this is not a problem in terms of our capacity to absorb the number of refugees. It's a political problem in terms of the will to absorb the refugees. And it's a global problem. My own translator is Syrian, living in Turkey. She wanted to get on one of these boats. I told her I would never talk to her again if she did, and promised her that I would try to get her refugee status in the US. And I actually went to the Deputy Secretary of State for Human Rights to try to arrange it. And the answer I got back at the end of the day is that maybe she could be eligible in 2017. Look, we're in a crisis where we need decisive action. And we cannot wait till 2017 to address the needs of some of these people. So thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to speak a little bit about the Commission's work and focus on some of the violations that we have been recording. The Syrian, the unrest in Syria started in March 2011, and as most, if not all of you will know. It was kind of a perfect storm what happened in a way. You had the Arab Spring that had given people a sense that change was possible. You had also the people who were tired of living under a fairly repressive and often violently repressive regime. And then you also had the effects really of a drought which had forced people from the countryside, from rural areas into city, so that you had a large number of young people under the age of 25 who were without employment, who were really seeking for a better life and believed that a better life was owed to them by their state. Once the protests were met with violence, there was an attempt to the protests to remain peaceful. That was obviously going to fail given the level of violence that was meted out to protesters, and the beginnings of what we still see today is a very pervasive campaign of enforced disappearances, of torture in detention centers, and of deaths in custody. The conflict quickly morphed, and now today I've put up a little bit of a map which can show you how fragmented, and even that map actually dates from June. So it's a little bit different now. The grey, which is ISIS, has moved quite farther towards Homs and Damascus, and the yellow, which are the YPG, the Kurdish forces, have taken more ground from ISIS. The Russian strikes, which have been going on for the last month or two, have allowed Assad forces to reclaim some ground, and I think in advance of what is likely to be a surge towards Aleppo city in the near future. There has been a proliferation of armed actors on the ground and in the skies, which have had massive consequences for violations against civilians. And to be clear, the landscape, the battlefield of Syria is incredibly complex. There are no good guys or bad guys. Even trying to identify bad guys and worse guys is a pretty failed attempt. It's also pretty complex because relationships between armed groups are very fluid across territories. So, for example, in Homs and Idlib, which are on the west of the country, you'll see groups fighting alongside Jabhat al-Nusra, but in the south, those same groups or the same affiliates of those groups will be fighting against them in the south. So the relationship between groups is incredibly fluid. The people who pay the price for all this fighting and for the lack of dialogue and lack of meaningful conviction on the part of parties who are fighting, but also their backers, have been civilians. And the violations against civilians have been massive in scope and extent. Violence is pervasive in Syria, and it has largely silenced the original voices that were calling for democratic reform in March 2011. As both Beth and Peter said, 1 in every 2 Syrians has now left their homes. The majority of those are internally displaced, but they are constantly, people who are internally displaced are often multiply internally displaced. So you have people that move 5 or 6 times, constantly seeking new and ever dwindling places of safety inside Syria. There's very little choice for people who are just trying to still survive in Syria. The majority of people that are on the move are in fact women and children. There are multiple reasons for that, but among those are the ubiquitous checkpoints that scatter the Syrian countryside. It is very difficult if you are a fighting age male to actually move around in Syria. If you come from a certain religious background or from a certain place which is identified as being in support of the opposition, you face huge danger of government checkpoints. Those can include just from assaults and beatings to disappearance, which is incredibly common, and then enforced disappearance is a gateway to a number of other violations, usually torture and often killing inside detention centers. The Commission, I want to talk a little bit about death in detention because it has been in the news quite a lot because of the Caesar photos, which former Ambassador Rapp and Syrian groups have been speaking to in Congress at the US Holocaust Museum. In fact, an exhibition of the photos is currently at Harvard Law School for the next couple of weeks. It was shown in the UN in New York this June. Although ISIS has kind of consumed the media, and it's for good reason, ISIS has basically branded itself and releases videos that catch the world's attention. It makes them incredibly terrifying. But in fact, it also tends to draw attention from the fact that the majority of people are still being killed by the Syrian government, and that tends to be in two ways. One, by aerial bombardments, using barrel bombs, but other gravity bombs, as you call them, which can take out whole city blocks, burying people in rubble. Particularly, we have seen the bombing of marketplaces in a way that can in no way be accidental, because we have multiple marketplaces being bombed across Aleppo city, for example, and in Idlib. Occasionally, we have the bombing of IDP camps, of schools, and of hospitals. And one of the key concerns of the Syrian conflict is the targeting of healthcare infrastructure. That has been by armed groups as well, but armed groups simply don't have the resources to cause as much damage as the Syrian state. So we've had the whole healthcare infrastructure of some parts of the country which are under opposition or armed group control completely being obliterated and targeted by the government forces. This has a huge impact on sick, the wounded, but it is also designed to make civilian life completely impossible in armed group controlled areas. So in Aleppo we saw, for example, people flooding, those who didn't flood over the border, flooding into government controlled areas because it was the only place where they weren't being bombed by the government. The destruction of healthcare infrastructure is particularly important when we speak about accountability, and it's something that there's general concern about, because although in accountability follow-up, it's likely that crimes of treatment violations such as torture and extrajudicial executions will be the subject of focus. In fact, conduct of facilities violations such as sieges and the attacks on specifically protected objects like hospitals tend not largely to be prosecuted, and it has been a real mainstay of this war. The other way in which the government has been responsible for tens of thousands, if not more, of civilian deaths and the deaths of captured belligerents has been through its systematic and pervasive torture in its detention centers. The Commission has interviewed over 4,000 people. The largest community of victims, if you call them that, in our database are people who have been held inside Syrian government detention centers. And I think there are probably at least 700 of those. Often they're victims of multiple violations, but of them they will have. And from the earliest stages of the war, what we saw was people being taken at checkpoints and held in multiple detention centers, often being transferred to detention centers, but generally always ending up in Damascus, notably in intelligence agency centers such as Palestine Branch 235 and the Meze Air Force Intelligence Centers. And in military hospital 601, which tends to be where the Caesar photographs of the bodies were taken. Inside detention centers, people die from torture. They also die from being denied medical care. There's a lot of injuries sustained during torture. And they actually just die from starvation and sickness of people who've been held for months and their bodies simply wear out. If you have a chance to see the Caesar photos, and I think there are some on the web that are there as part of this advocacy campaign on accountability, you'll see that in fact many of them are just emaciated. It's not that they have been injuries are necessarily visible on their bodies. ISIS continues to be a threat unlike ever, one that I've personally ever worked on. Peter perhaps has a longer history in this work, but there are something that I can say is I spent this summer in Iraqi Kurdistan, northern Iraq, interviewing Yazidi women and girls. And when I say women and girls, I should actually probably just say girls, since the vast majority of them are under 18 and in some cases as young as 9. And in my life, I've never heard the stories that these women have told. And ISIS has committed a number of violations, public executions in town squares, and on Fridays is very common, as are lashings and amputations. They conduct indiscriminate shelling. They're enforcing a siege of Deir ez-Zor city, where 300,000 people are being trapped without food, although it bears saying that the government is also helping to enforce that siege. But the Yazidi women and girls were captured from Sinjar in Iraq, and I think people will probably remember the flight to the mountain and some people dying on the mountain. Most of those that were captured never made it to the mountain. Their villages were too far away. They had perhaps a little bit too much faith in the Peshmerga's ability to repel ISIS at that time. And these women have been put into what can only be described as a system that is incredibly organized, that is incredibly rational, where they're being moved from identifiable locations inside Iraq. The youngest ones who are unmarried and therefore virgins are taken early on. Those that are transported to Syria have been sold in slave markets after having their hair inspected. Women are being sold multiple times because once they're sold to someone, they're seen as private property. They can be sold on, they can be given as gifts, they can be willed. One woman I spoke to had been sold 15 times, and she had been with her children. And in fact, when we were going to interview the mother, the children went to complete pieces because the mother was having to leave the room with people that she didn't know. And the level of trauma of Syrians in general has been incredible. But, within the Yazidi community, which is only 700,000 people, the trauma has been complete, and that includes the killing of Yazidi men on capture, the taking of Yazidi boys once they hit the age of around 7 to be recruited and trained as ISIS fighters, and the sexual enslavement and really dehumanization of the Yazidi women has been something unlike I've ever seen. It's also something ISIS does particularly unapologetically. And the one thing that I think is important to underscore about ISIS is that in the media they're often portrayed as just irrationally violent or thuggish, and actually they are extremely violent, but they are highly rational. As Peter said, the core of ISIS remains the remnants of the Ba'ath state. They are durable because they understand how to run a state. They have run a state before, a lot of them, at the higher echelons. And taking them seriously and understanding how they use violence to achieve ends, and how they use particularly terrifying images also to achieve ends is important, I think. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the destruction of cultural property inside Syria. Actually, although it's come kind of to the fore with the destruction of the Temple of Baal and the destruction of sites in Palmyra by ISIS, in fact, the destruction of property in Syria has been going on since almost the start of the violent unrest, through indiscriminate shelling, through the use of tunnel bombs in Aleppo, the burning of the Aleppo souk. What makes ISIS a bit different is that they're obviously deliberately targeting and going through a process of erasing Syrian history that they don't see fits with their ideology. But the culture and heritage of Syria has been erased and has been destroyed, has been kind of chipped away at, whether through indiscriminate attacks, whether through parties using citadels to fight in, using Trappish Valley to fight in. So what I say about violence is violence has the function of silencing people. That was the aim of the initial shooting at protesters. It was to silence them, to say that this is not allowed, you need to go back to being complacent, you need to be silent, you can't stand up against the state. Violence has morphed into something almost unrecognizable from its origins, but that is still the function of violence. And what we see now is people being physically erased, they're being disappeared, they're being killed, and their culture and their history is going along with them. Backers of the conflict have a lot to answer for. What we have seen and what the Commission continues to say is that while lots of countries, including prominent members of the Security Council, speak the language of peace, constantly call for peace negotiation, in fact what they do is they invest in war. And they have a kind of a dual approach which cannot stand. You cannot simultaneously bomb and arm countries and then and not make your support for parties conditional on their behavior in the battlefield and their willingness to make compromises. The refugee situation has focused a lot recently on Europe. And Peter's spoken a lot about that, and Peter's probably better speak about it, that he has been on the ground with people coming into Europe. The only thing I would ask you all to think about is that how many people have come to Europe? Maybe 500,000 people have now tried.
650,000.
650,000 people have been trying to get into Europe. It has caused a political earthquake in Europe. More than 4 million people are refugees in the region. There has been an equation of geographic responsibility and moral responsibility. Lebanon is now more than a quarter of its population are refugees. What is being expected of the countries surrounding Syria is beyond what it is possible for them to do, and that they have managed so far has been incredible. But there are massive funding shortfalls on food and clothing. Jordan, they've suspended the food program to refugees because of funding shortfalls, and we're heading into another winter. Ultimately, the fire is inside Syria. Syria is a country that can no longer hold itself up, and there is no amount of helping refugees in Europe, and there is no amount of trying to deal with the smoke of the fire that's going to help. Ultimately, the solution to the Syrian conflict has to be found inside Syria, and that is going to be part of a political process that at least deals with the original conflict between the government and the armed groups. Bearing in mind, I think the conflict with ISIS will be going on for some time, regardless of the resolution of that first conflict. As Peter said, one thing to point out is that in Geneva II, there were no women, in fact, in Geneva II at all. This is a war that is waged primarily by men. Women suffer, women and children suffer greatly, as do men. But certainly what is going to be very important is that more female voices are heard or in the room in discussing the peace process. So that's probably it.
Thank you both for those candid and sobering observations. I wanted to ask, taking up a point you made about how people should not be sort of forced to live under a dictatorship, even if that dictatorship brings stability, basically. And the rhetoric coming out of Washington and some other capitals as well has been that Assad must go. And that rhetoric sort of disappeared for a while, and now it's reemerged in a way. What do you think, both of you, are the prospects for Assad getting asylum somewhere, getting refuge somewhere? And is that even a solution, or has the situation now so deteriorated such that there are other sort of loci of power who will just fill in whatever vacuum getting Assad out and his family out might create?
Look, on your first point, I think it's a false dichotomy to talk about dictatorship versus ISIS. We have to put other choices on the table for the region and keep a more democratic human rights perspective, respecting option as the ultimate best future for the Middle East. Because as we see in Egypt today, we tried military dictatorship in the Middle East, and they're not only very bad at abusing their own people, they're also complete idiots when it comes to running the economy and doing anything else. And you see the same in Burma, the military dictatorships are very good at corruption and human rights abuses, and they're not very good at running government. So we do need to fight to keep other options on the table. And we can't just, swing from trying to get Assad to leave to, okay, Assad can stay now because ISIS is worse. They're both bad options for the Syrian people. But we have to understand that there are many Syrians who support the Syrian state because they fear the alternative. And those include most of the minorities in Syria and most of secular Syrian society. I mean, I went to Syria many times before this war. And it was a remarkably secular society. Women did not have to cover up their hair, and many women worked at universities and in government. They don't want to live under a Saudi Arabian-style Wahhabi regime. So we do have to acknowledge that these communities have legitimate fears. And if you look at what happened to the Christian community in Iraq and the Yazidis, who've been living in these areas for 2,000 years plus, and are some of the most original Christian communities in the world. They still worship St. John the Baptist. They have been completely wiped out. And that's the first time in 2,000 years that they've disappeared. So these are legitimate fears for many of these minority communities. And reassuring these minority communities, including the Alawites in Syria, that there is a future for them, and that they would not face genocide or disappearance if there is a change towards a new regime in Syria, is a very important goal. And it's been almost completely ignored by the dialogue that has taken place. The future of Assad, ultimately we do need accountability for these crimes. Nobody ever thought Milosevic was going to be put on trial for the crimes he committed. And he ended up on trial. So, if he wants to go on vacation in Russia for a couple of years, fine. But ultimately, we do need to see some accountability, and that's why the documentation of these crimes is very important.
Yeah, I'll just say I think these states, and I include like states like Libya and Syria, are set up so that they can't exist without these regimes in charge. It's the way the regime perpetuates is if they fall, the society can't function. I think in Syria there has been a false equation, which I think is really put forward a lot by Russians in how they speak about the conflict, of it being one war and you need Assad there to fight against ISIS. In fact, I see it as almost two completely separate conflicts. You have the original conflict between armed groups and the government, and then you have the conflict with ISIS in the north. And the resolution of the first and the issues that are related to the first conflict will not aid the resolution of the second. The fight against ISIS, I think, will go on even if the first conflict is resolved, because ISIS obviously will not form part of any peaceful process of negotiation. My feeling, I suppose, to give a most direct answer to the question, is that the reason that Assad will remain is less because of ISIS, and it's more going to be because of the lack of coherence and maturity of the Syrian armed opposition group, which are fractured into dozens, if not hundreds, of different groups who invade and disappear and reappear. And so it's very difficult to have a leadership which is common. And so, I mean, my opinion, which is not the opinion of the Commission of Inquiry, is that it won't be a question of whether Assad stays or goes, it'll be a question of the regime. But I would imagine that Assad would probably stay for a little while and then would be given a head start on accountability. So the issue of accountability would remain, but he might get a couple months start for
Yeah, turning to accountability, so I know the work of the Commission was not just to document crimes, but the idea is to document crimes to lay the groundwork for future transitional justice efforts, including criminal accountability. There was, midway through your work, a list of individuals was produced. It was then filed under seal. Relatively recently, members of the Commission have talked about unsealing that, and could you just talk a little bit about just the internal thinking about what role kind of naming names might play in bringing about either processes of deterrence or some step towards accountability?
Sure. The Commission has a dual mandate. So one part of our mandate is the documentation of violations of international law inside Syria. The second part of the mandate is to pursue accountability for the victims of those violations. The Commission has a specific team that works on what we call linkage evidence. So trying to link the violations on the ground to people in the upper echelons. Often you have, for example, people who are in detention centers know who's in charge at the detention center, but you still need to do a lot more work to link that person who's in charge up the echelons. So we have a team which does that. In fact, we produce a list which is called the alleged perpetrators list at the end of every mandate. So we're now on our 5th mandate. So there are 4 lists, and they've now been consolidated into one long list, and they contain the names of individuals, but also the units and groups. So it's not an indictment list because it has groups on it, but it's a continual list. And there is this discussion which is going on in the Commission about what we do with this list of names. And I'll speak about the discussion in a moment, but I would say is that there's a huge amount of focus on ICC or maybe an ad hoc tribunal. But there are cases going on, often at a very low level, often related to people who sought asylum or who fought with armed groups in national prosecutions. And so the Commission to date has been working with national prosecutions authorities in Sweden, Germany, Denmark, the States, in relation to cases that they're bringing domestically. That at the moment is the only real progress we've seen on issue accountability, but it's there and we're contributing to it. In relation to the list of names, I think we are continually renewing our decision to release the names. I think the issue is that once you release the name, that's not the end of the discussion. It's the beginning of a much larger discussion, including what kind of information you have against these people, how do you protect the names of the people that gave you that information when it's obvious that the information that you have could only be known to a really small group of defectors who've left the country, and also looking at, I suppose, what would happen to people whose names have been released. One of the things that we bear, I worked in West Africa before, and the prosecution kind of pursued a strategy in relation to Charles Taylor, where they had released names of people who would have been witnesses in the Taylor trial while he hadn't yet left to Nigeria. And a number of those people, in the months before he left, were executed, in fact. So there are lots of different ways. I think the key thing is not to do something that people find emotionally satisfying. and to find something that will actually affect change. Because if you release names and you have no plans for the pursuing of accountability, it will initially make quite a big splash, everyone will feel quite happy about it, and then nothing will get done, and you might have endangered the people who gave you the information and also the people on the list, none of which helps anyone. So I think when you come back around to March, that conversation is going to be had again, and we are actually building a list in such a way that we would be more likely to release it.
You know, one strategy that we've pursued at Human Rights Watch is to be very clear and name the people that we know are responsible for some of the abuses being committed in Syria. We did a whole report on all of the different torture centers that we could identify in Syria, and we named the commanders and deputy commanders, everybody who we could identify with certainty in that report. Because, you know, Assad's options in terms of leaving or whatever are very limited. But we do want the commanders under him to worry about their accountability.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with your connection. Please carry on.
Sorry. You know, we want them to understand that they're not just following orders, and that if they're committing war crimes, that they can face the consequences. Because the people at the top are already committed. It's very important to do it at the kind of mid-level. I think the one criticism I would make of the Commission of Inquiry is that they waited a long time before recommending a referral to the International Criminal Court. And if they had done that earlier, when war crimes of the scale that wouldn't have justified a referral were already being committed, I think there would have been an opportunity to get more people on the ground to reconsider some of their options. And I think that was one of the few failures. I mean, we worked together very closely, obviously. Of the things that I regret is that they didn't do it sooner.
Let me follow up on that aspect, speaking about the International Criminal Court. And there was, of course, finally a proposal that went forward. It generated a double veto, which is rare. Both China and Russia vetoed that. To what extent would the ICC, and you seem to suggest it could have actually played a role in deterrence, but let's say we could move that referral resolution forward now. What is the role for the ICC here? Is it more of a feel-good exercise, given the operational difficulties of actually doing any investigations on the ground? Or do we do it anyway because it clearly meets the threshold tests of the ICC? Just what are the thinking about, and to what extent, how deep do you think the support of some of those states that came around to an ICC referral actually is? I mean, we've had 2 referrals already, and the Security Council has done nothing to support either one of those referrals or the cases that generated from them. So the ICC would be on its own again in a deeply divisive environment.
I think that at the level of accountability, it's the conversation is not only about how perpetrators who are inside Syria, alleged perpetrators inside Syria, should be brought to justice. It's also a kind of an issue of how accountable is the Security Council. They're the primary responsible for international peace and security. They're clearly failing to fail that role. They haven't been able to see beyond national self-interest. And what you have now is a lot of states, many of whom are on the Security Council, fighting for influence over a country that barely exists anymore. I think the referral of Syria to the ICC or even to an ad hoc tribunal, I know that's been mentioned. I'm more lukewarm on ad hoc tribunals and hybrid tribunals after having worked at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. But I think it's a powerful message. I don't think you can have an international system of accountability that is so beholden to political interest and then expect to have any deterrent effect whatsoever. Whether the question would be whether the ICC would then have the resources to actually pursue something, which is a big question, as you can see in the Sudan case, where the referral to Sudan is fantastic, but it's become a mockery. You have Bashir traveling to China, who's on the Security Council without anything.
Or to South Africa.
Or to South Africa.
Which is a state party.
The state party. So it's
For now.
For now, yes. I think in a conflict as political as this, international criminal justice has not got to the stage of maturity where it can divorce itself from political interest, and that is not a problem that is alone in relation to Syria. I mean, you think even in Libya, in the IC case in Libya, it's pretty abysmal in terms of really you can see the prosecutors and really work the case.
You know, I'd like to make 2 points. First of all, just in terms of the state of international justice, you know, these are concepts that we've basically developed over the last half century after World War II and the Nuremberg trials. And I think we have accomplished a lot over that time in terms of the world now framing the dialogue about what happens in conflict around the Geneva Conventions and war crimes. You know, nobody's saying, this is my country and I'll do whatever I want. When we issue reports like the report I wrote about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, it led to immediate action by the international community and ultimately the dismantling of one of the last chemical weapons programs on Earth. Human rights abusers have to justify their actions against these charges. So I think in terms of the kind of broader state of the discussion, of the dialogue, we have made very significant accomplishments, and we have developed a very important body of law coming out of the Yugoslav tribunals and the Rwanda tribunals and the ad hoc tribunals. We still have many national prosecutions going on, including many about abuses committed in Syria. But the International Criminal Court clearly is an institution which is struggling. Many of their cases are coming out of Africa, which is the reason it's come under a lot of criticism from various African states, even though the point of these cases is to protect Africans from crimes committed by their leaders. And a lot of the cases coming out of Libya have seen no cooperation. I feel for the International Criminal Court. It's one thing to try to prosecute crimes committed in a country like Yugoslavia, where you get your head around the kind of dimensions of the conflict and you can prosecute. It's another one to, you know, be spending your time 1 year on the situation in Libya and then being moved to the Central African Republic. It's a huge challenge for a still struggling court with diminishing international support. And so it really is a dangerous moment for the concept of international justice.
So you raised the issue of chemical weapons, and there have been at least, I think, 6 documented attacks involving chemical weapons. Your commission has looked at the issue. There's also been a separate UN commission that was asked not to identify who was responsible for the attack, but to confirm the existence or not of the attack. And I think the audience would appreciate your perspective on what you're seeing in terms of the use of chemical attacks, of chemical weapons, and can we identify which group, if not all 3, have now gotten access to chemical weapons and are using them?
Yeah. So in terms of the large-scale attacks involving the use of sarin gas, despite quite an extensive campaign by Russia and what I would call the dark net of, you know, Russian-sponsored bloggers and whatever, we were able to establish pretty conclusively that the Syrian government was responsible for those chemical weapons attacks involving sarin, because only the government has the weapon systems and the delivery systems and the amount of sarin gas that was used in those attacks. And I think the conclusions of our report, just days afterwards, the Syrians agreed to dismantle their chemical weapons program, so they knew the game was up, and Russia knew the game was up. Since then, there have been a number of much smaller attacks, including attacks involving the use of mustard gas by ISIS against the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. Those are not chemical weapons programs, basically. They seem to be using leftover stocks from the undestroyed Iraqi stockpile. There are stockpiles which were sealed by the United Nations inside Iraq in areas now under the control of ISIS, so that's probably the most likely source. And then there's been a number of even smaller attacks where the perpetrators have not been identified, which were attacks involving chemical agents, but not necessarily attacks involving chemical weapons. And the difference is, they didn't use a traditional delivery system which actually allowed the chemical agents to be delivered in an effective way, effective in the sense of killing people. We will continue to document those, but obviously the real threat comes from more organized chemical weapons attacks. We do believe that most of the Syrian stocks have now been handed over and secured. Many of them have been destroyed. But of course the possibility exists that there are hidden stocks that were not disclosed that can still be used in this conflict.
Yeah. Just in relation to the different groups, I suppose within the United Nations that are groups that have been mandated by the Human Rights Council, Security Council. Initially, the Salstrom team, which is the one working on the August 2013 attack, actually Assad attack, had a mandate to determine whether chemical weapons had been used, chemical agents had been used, but not a mandate to discuss perpetrators. In general, that has changed. There's now a shift to a group that also, a commission within that can also look at perpetrators. The Commission is quite happy about that. Chemical weapons requires a very specific kind of expertise and testing, which the Commission of Inquiry doesn't have. So our aim has always been to kind of work with groups and see whether we can support them and to move information between the groups in a way that's respect confidentiality, if that is an issue, respects any kind of protection of sources, but allows people to work more efficiently, so not duplicating. The Commission, I think, in relation to the August 2013 attacks was more cautious, as I think maybe UN people attached to the UN tend to be. And I agree with Peter that, I think that we could have come out more strongly on ICC referral earlier on, but it's a function of perhaps being in the UN that the people who put their names on it tend to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit lagging behind. In the end, on those attacks, we said it was consistent with weaponry held in the government stockpile, but there were still concerns about how those weapons had been delivered and when they had happened, and so we made a nod. We confirmed there that they had been used and made a nod towards the perpetrator, but what didn't come out and say unequivocally it was the government. That has shifted in relation to recent attacks in Idlib and maybe in Hama in March and April, where you saw the use of chlorine and phosgene gas in barrel bombs, so again not delivered very effectively. Caused, I think, a couple of deaths, but that was partly because of the fact they were in a barrel bomb. And those were certainly dropped by government helicopters. And we've seen, obviously, this report of mustard gas by ISIS, and there are unconfirmed reports of them in the north of the country. What I would say about the use of chemical weapons is it's quite incredible that this is the way we're discussing the use of chemical weapons. And what we have seen in Syria is that a kind of a normalization of violence, both in Syria and by people out of Syria talking about violence. So things that would have made the news in 2011, 2012, a missile hitting a school somewhere, probably will not make the news now. In fact, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people in this room probably wouldn't have even been aware of some of the smaller barrel bomb attacks using chlorine and phosgene in Idlib and Hama, because they didn't kill many people, but the intention to use a chemical weapon was there. And this is how normal the extreme violence of the Syrian conflict has become. And it's really become a conflict without any legal limits. There is no adherence to international law in Syria. There's no attempt. It's a complete culture of impunity that has gripped it. And it's why now we go to the most violent extremes and where ISIS has kind of capitalized in branding itself, because it produces these images which are violent, even though tremendous more violence is being done. We're just kind of used to it. It's been going on for a long time by government and other actors.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, if you have a paper that no academic publication wants to publish, go to the London Review of Books. They'll publish it. They published Cy Hirsch's theory that it was the Saudis. So anything, you don't even need footnotes. Yeah. Martians at Stanford, no problem. But on a more serious note, I think there's a general tendency to focus on exotic weapons by journalists and by other commentators. The reality is that in most conflicts, including the Syrian conflict, The crudest of weapons, the barrel bomb, are doing most of the killings and most of the terrorizing of the population, which is why we're pushing for a UN Security Council resolution to stop the use of barrel bombs, because that really is what's killing most people in Syria at the moment.